Before we actually begin this morning, I want you to just kind of look around for just a moment and look at everyone who's here. We talk about perspective sometimes, and I think growth has happened so slowly through the years that we forget just how blessed we have been. Because if you remember, we started off with 17 people. And do you know how many people we have who are missing today? We have 16 people missing today. So if this had been our first Sunday, there would have been one person here doing everything. So sometimes growth happens so slowly that we forget. And we have a lot of visitors here today. We're thankful for you. And we have a great group, and we're thankful for all of you and everything you do for us. Happy Father's Day to those who are fathers. You know, if you look at statistics, Father's Day is probably the most neglected holiday. And it's going to be today too. I thought about doing a lesson on Father's Day, but I really didn't want to mess up our series on Nehemiah. And I figured if the fathers are like me, you just go, yeah, it's just another day. Thank you. It's a time to get hugs and kisses from your kids, and that's about all. So with that said, happy Father's Day. But if you would, please take out your pew Bibles and turn to page 550. We're going to spend most of our time this morning studying from Nehemiah. Now, Nehemiah, if you've ever read the book of Nehemiah, chapter 3 is honestly probably one you skipped right over. Because as you start reading the book of Nehemiah chapter 3, you realize that it's filled with lots of names, lots of difficult names. And it's one we have a tendency to skip over, but it's an important one. Have you ever heard of Stefan Sigmund from Romania? For many years, he did everything he possibly could to get into the Guinness Book of World Records. His first attempt, they said, went up in smoke. He built a contraption that looked like an air filter for a car, and he decided to try to smoke 800 cigarettes at the same time. Now, after doing this and attempting this, see, when I saw this, you know what I first thought of? I thought of Charles. Sorry, Charles. But I thought of you standing at the street corner. But when he first attempted this, only after he did this did he later discover that the Guinness Book of World Records no longer accepts these kind of accomplishments. And so, in another time, he decided to try to eat 29 hard-boiled eggs in under 4 minutes. Unfortunately, at that time, the Guinness Book of World Records had quit taking records for gluttony. And so he decided that he had one more attempt. So he decided to jump off a 135-foot cliff, only to find out that before he had jumped, a new record had already been set at 176 feet. If you're like most of us want to hear our names mentioned in a positive way, don't we? We want to see our names emboldened. We want to hear people say good things about us. And our text this morning, if you read from Nehemiah chapter 3, all of those names are there for a reason. Because they accomplished great things. And Nehemiah wanted to make sure that their families and generations to come would understand what they accomplished. But one of the things that is interesting is that Nehemiah is not mentioned at all. Nehemiah wanted to make sure that he kept the focus and the attention on others. Now, at first glance, Nehemiah chapter 3 looks a bit dry. One commentator calls Nehemiah 3 this. He refers to it as a colorless memorandum of assignments. It reads much like the book of 1 Chronicles, with a list of long names that are difficult to pronounce, and chronology that seems meaningless to many of us. For some, it's hard to just muddle through. This morning, I wanted you to turn there, even though we're going to have some of the verses on the screen, because I want you to see the list of names that is mentioned. This morning, we're only going to hit the highlights. Number one, because I had to listen to an audiobook like 3 times to figure out how to say the names I'm going to pronounce this morning, and I knew I would mess them all up if I tried all of them. But number 2, we don't have to go through every detail to understand what Nehemiah was trying to get across. In case you've missed the last couple of weeks, let's set the historical context so we remember and understand what's happening. In 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian army captured the Jews. During that time, Jerusalem was destroyed. The walls around Jerusalem were knocked down, and the temple was burned and destroyed. The people were deported. The people were forced into slavery. and the city of Jerusalem was left in complete ruin. But we have to remember that God did not forsake his people. Now at the time, it seemed like that to his people, but over time he moved King Cyrus to make a decree to allow some of the Jews to return. This took place in 3 different stages over about 100 years. During that time, they were allowed to migrate back to Jerusalem, and when they got there, only then did they discover that Jerusalem was still in utter ruins and destroyed. But in Nehemiah's prayer in chapter 1, we see Nehemiah took a great interest in that city. He wanted to rebuild the walls. And last week we focused on a couple of things that Nehemiah did before he began. He waited, he trusted, he prayed, he planned, and he told others about God's greatness. But he also started by tackling 5 different things. He replenished his resources. Remember, before he did anything, he rested for 3 days. Now, I'm not sure. I guess if you were working really hard. I rested this week for, I think, 5 days. And I'm more tired after doing nothing for 5 days than I was before we went on vacation. Nehemiah assessed the need. He looked at all of the things that needed to be done. He went out and he recruited workers. He inspired confidence in them. And then he handled the opposition that took place. And chapter 3, as we move into chapter 3, we see that Nehemiah had an amazing gift of administration and organization. Nehemiah was able to organize at least, and there's probably more, but there are 44 separate groups that are mentioned that are rebuilding this wall. Remember, he went out in Nehemiah chapter 2, verses 13 through 16. He went out on a moonlight ride and looked at the walls to decide what needed to be rebuilt. And I think if we get nothing from our passage today that we're going to look at, except this, let's remember that we can accomplish more working together than we can apart. As you read through, and if you want to be reading Nehemiah chapter 3 as I'm talking, that's fine. I'm happy that you're reading Scripture. And if you're doing that, I want you to notice these words. Notice the words next to him, next to them, after them. These expressions are used 28 different times in this chapter. And the principle in all of this is every person in God's work is to be involved because there is work for everyone to do. Sometimes it's hard to find the right job, isn't it? It's hard to find something that feels like it fits for us, both in our career and even in the Lord's church. Sometimes we look and we say, I just don't know what I should be doing. We're struggling to find a niche. Now, I know I've been talking a lot without getting to Scripture, and I have one more quick little story I want to share. Because sometimes I think it helps us to hear other people's job history. So listen to this one for just a moment. My first job was working in an orange juice factory, but I got canned because I couldn't concentrate. Then I worked as a lumberjack, but I just couldn't hack it, so they gave me the axe. After that, I tried to be a tailor, but I just wasn't suited for it, mainly because it was a so-so job. Next, I tried working in a muffler factory, but it was exhausting. I wanted to be a barber, but I couldn't cut it. I attempted to be a deli worker, but any way I sliced it, I just couldn't cut the mustard. I studied a long time to become a doctor, but I didn't have any patience. I became a professional fisherman, but discovered that I couldn't live on my net income. I managed to get a good job working for a pool maintenance company, but the work was just too draining. Next, I found being an electrician interesting, but the work was shocking. After many years of trying to find steady work, I finally got a job as a historian, until I realized there was no future in it. And then finally, he says, I heard another guy say, I like work, it fascinates me, I can sit and look at it for hours. Now, I'm sure many of us probably relate to this last comment. But in the Lord's church, there is no place for sitting on the couch. There is no place for waiting for award ceremonies. As we see in this chapter, God's people work together with an amazing amount of teamwork because they were focused on the ultimate goal, and they did it together through teamwork. Nehemiah had to build his team around a central rallying point. He pointed them to the purpose of their work. The purpose of everything they were doing was to glorify God. Remember last time we talked about how not only without a wall around them was Jerusalem in danger from enemies, but it also looked really bad because it looked like God had abandoned them. And so when they were working, they were really working to glorify God. They weren't just working on walls. They were working on worshiping God and honoring Him. They longed to be God's city. They longed for that city to regain its previous splendor. I think 1 Corinthians puts this concept so succinctly. It says, "So whether you eat or drink, or whatever you do it all for the glory of God." Nehemiah understood this concept. You wouldn't think of working on a wall as something that would glorify God. You're picking up bricks and laying them in place. But the purpose of the wall was to glorify God. So let's look at verse 1 of chapter 3. Eliashib, the high priest, and his fellow priests went to work and rebuilt the sheep gate. They dedicated it and set doors in its place. Now when we read this, we say, okay, what is the significance of starting with the gate here? With starting with the wall? But there was a significance. This was their way of saying, we're going to put God first. Now close to the wall's northeast corner, and I don't know if you've ever seen pictures of the walls around Jerusalem, but just think of it kind of, I should have drawn it out, but the top is fairly square. It comes down, and then it has kind of a long leg, almost like Florida. Now we're up at the upper northeast corner, right by the temple. So because there was a gate that was close to the temple, that gate is where they brought all of the sheep in who were going to be sacrificed in the temple to God. That's why it was called the Sheep's Gate. So Nehemiah is establishing that their relationship with God is central. He's starting at the gate that most honors God because it's closest to the temple and because it's where all the sheep come in. And as soon as they started, they had a dedication. We have to make sure that our lives are where they should be, that we're dedicated to God before we begin working for Him. One of the things that we often do is we make the mistake of focusing so much upon the work or the task that we forget how much God is involved. God is not impressed with our labor, He's impressed with our heart. And if our heart is not involved, then we'll never be pleasing to Him. If you've already read the book of Nehemiah, and I hope you have, you know the final results. The wall was built in a record 52 days. Now, it's hard to know exactly, but we believe the wall was between a mile and a half long, 4 to 5 feet thick, and 20 to 30 feet tall. So this is an amazing undertaking. Can you imagine today? It would take longer than 52 days to get EPA approval because they would be afraid we're going to hurt a butterfly or something. Nehemiah got the whole thing accomplished in 52 days with the hands of the people. In this chapter, I want us to see 6 principles that I think will help us work well with others. Number 1, leaders must set the example. If anybody should have been busy in the city, it should have been the priests, because God's reputation was at stake. The high priest here had no hesitation, using his hands to swing a hammer or push a wheelbarrow. Now keep in mind, the high priest at this time would have been dressed a little differently than we are today, or than we're used to. Most likely he wore a sacred garment of gold, of blue, of purple, and scarlet. It's a garment that would have been made out of fine linen. On the upper part of his garment, he would have had 12 stones that were set in gold, with the 12 tribes of Israel engraved on them. On his head, he would have worn a dark blue turban with the phrase, "Holy to the Lord." Picture that. Out picking up rocks, building a wall. And yet, that's exactly what he was doing. You know, it's sad, but this priest, Eliashib, did not remain true to God. He started out great, but somewhere along the line, he got sidetracked. And we will see later on, in Nehemiah chapter 13, verses 4 through 9, we see him start working for the enemies instead. And I think there's an important principle that we can learn there. It doesn't really matter where we start. It matters that we stay consistent and finish with God at the end. Some people who enthusiastically begin a job or begin a ministry or something in the church drop out for one reason or another. Number 2, God uses all kinds of people. Let's look at verse 8. Uzziel, son of Harhaiah, one of the goldsmiths, repaired the next section, and Hananiah, one of the perfume makers, made repairs next to that. The Lord did not need 1,000 masons. He didn't need 1,000 carpenters to rebuild the wall. He needed ordinary people who were willing to do the work. Now, he needed somebody like Nehemiah who could oversee it, but he didn't need all the masons. He needed regular people who were willing to do the work. People from a wide variety of backgrounds, people from a wide variety of trades began working on the wall. The rulers and the priests and the regular people all worked together. Many of them lived within the area, which could have been 10 or 15 miles. Now, I know to us, we look at that and we say, oh, that's nice. But I'm not sure we really understand the implications of a culture that is so divided by wealth and so divided by your status, where you were born in life. Can you imagine the rulers working together with a farmer? That's what we have here. Because they were dedicated to God. There was a place for everyone. And there was a job for everyone to do. As we use our gifts, we will be fruitful, we will be multiplied, and the church will be blessed. One of the key words in this section or in this chapter, is the word section. It's used 13 different times. The wall was divided into certain sections to work on. Because no one could construct the wall by themselves. And if you looked at the wall and said, this is my job, most of us would be overwhelmed and we would stop. No one can do everything, but everyone can do something. Romans 12 says, we have different gifts according to the grace given to us. Are you using your gifts right now? If not, it's time to grab a brick. It's time to jump in and do what Nehemiah's people would have done. But having said that there is a place for everyone and a job for everyone to do, there will always be those people who are not willing to exert themselves. Most of the people worked, but some shirked their responsibility. In verse 5, we see these words. The next section was repaired by the men of Tekoa, but their nobles would not put their shoulders to the work under their supervisors. Tekoa was a town about 11 miles from Jerusalem. And while many of the people commuted to Jerusalem to do the work, the nobles from Tekoa called in sick. They said, no thanks. But it's interesting because the text brings out much more meaning. The original text brings out more meaning than we see in English here. They were too proud to submit themselves to the supervisors of the job. They were too important to get their hands dirty. The word or the phrase would not put their shoulders to the work suggests that it was pride more than anything that kept them from pitching in. Nehemiah uses agricultural imagery that all of them would have understood when he describes a stiff-necked ox who refuses to be yoked. That's how he describes the men of Tekoa. They were unwilling to roll up their sleeves and get to work. Sometimes do we feel like maybe we're too important to spend time with a hurting person, to teach a study, to help pour concrete. Maybe we don't feel like we're too important, but we feel like we're just too busy. We're too busy to help somebody. It's easy to get sidetracked. It's easy to get thinking that way, isn't it? The book of Jeremiah has a stinging rebuke for those of us who sometimes think that. The book of Jeremiah says, "A curse on him who is lax doing the Lord's work." That's a pretty stinging rebuke. But more than that, if we're not doing the Lord's work, we're missing out on some of the greatest blessings and privileges that we could have. Some of the happiest Christians that you will ever know are those who are serving. On the other hand, some of the grumpiest Christians that you will ever know are those who are not willing to put their shoulders to the work. Number 4, some were willing to do more work. In every church, in every project, there will always be people who for some reason are not willing to serve. But there will be others who do more than their fair share of the work. Remember the men that we just read about, the men from Tekoa? When they finished their section of the wall, even though their nobles were not helping out, let's drop down to verse 27. Next to them, the men of Tekoa repaired another section. So the men of Tekoa were here without their nobles. They finished their work and they said, "Give us more. We want more work to do." Refusing to follow the bad example of their leaders, these workers went another mile. Now, can you imagine how easy it would have been to fall into a pity party? To say, everybody else has everybody from their village here. It's just us. There's no way we can accomplish this. That's not what they did, though, is it? They did their work. And when they were done, they said, "Give us more." The men of Benui did exactly the same thing in verses 18 and in verse 24. Another one named Meshullam completed one part in verse 4. And then if you jump down to verse 31, we see that he repaired another section. So we have a lot of people who were willing to do more than their fair share. And in verse 21, Meremoth, son of Uriah, son of Hakaz, repaired another section from the entrance of Eliashib's house to the end of it. So after he repaired the section that was in front of his house, he walked over to his neighbors and he said, "Do you need any help? Let me help you." There's a tendency for most of us to finish the work that we volunteered for and then to stop, to stretch out our arms and to say, "Wow, that felt great. What a good job I did." And to be done. But when this group finished theirs, they went to their neighbors and they said, "Can we help?" They understood that God's work is never finished. When we complete one job for the Lord, there's always another one that is ready and willing to go. We can't sit back. As long as there's work to be done in the kingdom, there is work for you. Number 5. Some of them worked with an amazing passion. In this entire chapter, there is only one man who is said to have worked zealously. In verse 20. Next to him, Barak, son of Zabbai, jealously repaired another section. Now the Hebrew word here that is translated zealously means to burn or glow. And it suggests that Barak burned a lot of energy. He wasn't just serving. He wasn't just doing his job. He was on fire. And you've seen those people, haven't you? Everyone else is busy at work doing their normal thing. But there's someone who stands out. There's someone who takes it to another level. And that was him. Now I think the amazing part of all of this is if we read verse 6, the Bible there says the people worked with all their heart. So the people who were working with all of their heart. They were engaged and dedicated. But there was something about Barak that made him stand out. He stood above the rest. And we need people like him. We need people that say, I don't really care what everyone else is doing. I am going to do my very best. Is there anyone who wants to be like Barak this morning? Are we willing to go the extra mile? Are we willing to burn with passion and zeal? Are we tired of just going through the motions? Barak was fired up. He was ready to work. And I think most of us could use a lot more passion in what we're doing. Sixth and finally, some of them were working as families. The final principle in this great passage is that some of these people worked as families, either on a section in front of their home or on the section that was in front of their neighborhood. At least 6 different workers, plus an unknown number of priests, repaired the portion of wall that was nearest to their house. If all of us followed that example, can you imagine the difference it would make in our communities? Can you imagine how differently our neighborhoods would work if we spent a lot of time in our communities trying to make a difference? Look at our neighbors as a mission field. Befriend them, serve them, pray for them. Not with ulterior motives, but because it's the right thing to do. I want to challenge each of us to identify 5 neighbors that live near us, and then do 3 different things. Number 1, pray for them. You don't have to tell them you're praying for them. It might be better if you don't tell them. Just privately pray for them. Show them that you care for them. And then share Christ. As we pray for them, God will give us opportunities to care for their needs, which will open up avenues to share the good news. Now, for this to happen, some of us might actually need to get to know our neighbors. I don't have that issue because I have Christy. Christy knows like everybody within a mile of our house. Most of our neighbors have keys to our house, and we have keys to their house. So it's easy for me through her. But can you imagine if it was just me alone in the house? They'd be like, does anybody live there? It's difficult to get out and to know people. But we're called to start at home. We're called to start where we are. But we're not supposed to stay there. Remember in verse 3, the fish gate was rebuilt by the sons of Hassenaah. And in verse 12, the daughters of Shalom worked on the wall. As families, we have the opportunity to be used in our neighborhoods. We have the opportunity to be used in our community. And instead of looking at just what we can do as an individual, we need to think creatively about how we can include our entire family. I think it's interesting. Through the years, there have been people that we know that because we've talked to them have come to worship. But do you know Carly has brought more people to church than I have? Neighbor-wise, friend-wise. Use your family. As a church, we have to be committed to making a difference and an impact in our community. But it has to start at home. In John chapter 15 verse 16, Jesus told his disciples that he had appointed them to go and to bear fruit. Now the word appointed means that he has strategically placed them. And that's kind of interesting. God has put us right where we need to be. So often we spend our time looking for greener pastures. We spend our time looking for better places, when really, we just need to work where we're at. If God's work is going to get done, we have to cooperate with one another. Our job is not to look at the wall next to us and criticize them for not doing as good a job, or to look at the wall next to us and say, look how great we are doing compared to those people over there. We have to remember that God's glory is at stake. Remember that nothing has ever been done for God without hard work. And we are working on a job that is so much bigger than any of us. We can only accomplish it together. We need to recognize that the leaders have to set the pace. That God uses all kinds of people. And even though God uses all kinds of people, still, there are going to be some who won't work. But there will be some who do even more work. Some people are going to work with amazing passion and zeal, and we can learn from them. And we need to work as families. You all know about geese. You know why they fly in a V formation. You know, often they cover thousands of miles before reaching their destination. But because they fly together, they can travel 71% further than if they flew alone. And that to me is an amazing statistic. No matter how much we enjoy being alone is scary. Being alone is never good for the long haul. You know me. You know I love to be alone, out in the desert. You know when the last time I rode my motorcycle was, my dirt bike? It was sometime last year. You know why? Because there's no one to ride with me. It's fun for a while, and then it's not. And when you're alone on the top of a mountain, it's a little scary sometimes. And it's that way in church as well. Sometimes we feel like we're the only one that's working on the wall. We need to remember we're all together. One lesson today stands above all others. It should be the natural instinct of a Christian to work together. Like swimmers on the United States Olympic relay team, everyone has to do their part if they want to win the medal. Whether it's with geese, if it's flapping or helping or honking, it doesn't matter what the job is, they're working together, which enables them to accomplish what they set out to do. And I'm convinced today that we can accomplish a tremendous amount if we work together. You know, when I first heard all of the people who weren't going to be here today, my first reaction is, oh man, we're going to have a small group. No matter how you look at it though, we're all here, we're all together, we're all looking at the same thing. And sometimes we just need to change our perspective just a little bit. When I started counting and realized that we had almost as many missing today as we started our first Sunday with, there's like a switch that changes. Those people are still gone, but I think differently about it. And I think if we look at the story of Nehemiah, and we understand when each of them looked at the wall, it was an overwhelmingly complex task. They said, there's no way we can do this. But because they worked together, they could. So this week, I want us to just think about a couple of things. I want you to ask yourself, will you find 5 neighbors who live close to you? I guess if you're not a neighbor, if you don't live close, you're probably not a neighbor. I don't know why I wrote that. But find 5 people that live close to you that you will pray for, that you will show them the care of Christ, and that ultimately you will share why Christ is important in your life. And I want you to ask, what can you do for the Lord's kingdom? Don't look at the whole wall. Look at the section of wall that's right in front of you and say, what can I do? We never want to close without offering an invitation. If you've never given your life to Christ, we invite you to do that. Or if you have, but you need the prayers of your brothers and sisters, please come forward as we stand and sing.